For 10 years, small treasures have been leaking into the market stalls of Luxor. A funeral papyrus here, a king's name on a linen band there. Names that should not exist above ground because the kings who owned them were buried 3,000 years ago, and their tombs have never been found. The new head of Egypt's Antiquities Service knows the objects are real, which means somewhere under the Theban hills there is a hole in the ground worth more than any bank in Egypt. He has a suspect arrested. The interrogation produces nothing. Then, one summer day, the suspect's own brother walks into the office of the district chief and gives it up. Not a tomb, a shaft. And at the bottom of the shaft, he says, pharaohs, rows of them. 11 days later, a museum man goes down that hole on a rope and finds a corridor stacked with the kings of Egypt. When the inventory is drawn up, the greatest name in the whole long story of the Nile, Ramses, takes up one line on a clerk's list. You know how tomb robbery stories end. Here's the one that doesn't. 3,000 years before that rope went down, the men who emptied this valley were caught, and the court that tried them wrote everything down. The questions, the names, the confessions. And that transcript is sitting in a museum today. The gold is gone, the paperwork is eternal. Start with the village. Korna sits on the Theban West Bank, built quite literally on top of the graveyard of an empire. Houses over tomb mouths, courtyards over shafts. Around the year 1871, members of one family of the village, the Abd el-Rasuls, found a hidden shaft in the cliffs near Deir el-Bahri. The story people tell says a stray goat found it for them. Every version has the goat. The record only has the hole. What the family did next took discipline that professional criminals would envy. They told no one, and for roughly a decade, they sold the contents in pieces. A papyrus here, a set of funeral jars there. Never enough at once to give away what they had. One book of the dead, belonging to a high priest, sold for 400 pounds, years of wages, for one object from a hole that held thousands. By 1881, the leaks had a pattern, and the pattern had a reader. Gaston Maspero, newly appointed head of the Antiquities Service, saw the same priestly family's name on too many of the objects surfacing in Luxor, and concluded someone was selling a tomb that officially did not exist. That spring, he had a suspect from the family arrested and questioned. He got nothing. The man was let go. What the interrogation could not do, the family did to itself. That June, the eldest brother, Mohammed, unhappy, the record says, with his partners, walked into the office of the district chief and volunteered everything. And his description was not of a tomb, it was of a vault, a shaft in the cliffs holding, he said, some 40 coffins, kings among them. Maspero was away in France, so the museum sent its assistant curator, Emile Brooks, with the young Egyptian scholar Ahmed Kamal beside him. On the 6th of July, Brooks was lowered into a hole in the cliff face on a rope, with a candle. What the candle found was a corridor stacked wall to wall with coffins, kings lying beside queens, dynasties shelved together like an archive, which, in a sense, is exactly what it was. Someone in antiquity had gathered rulers from across centuries into one hidden place, and the sand had kept the secret ever since. Brooks's own tally, drawn up that month, lists 25 royal and princely names, and 5 more of high rank, Seqenenre, who died of his wounds, Ahmose, who drove out the invaders, the warrior Thutmose the Third, Seti the First, and his son, Ramses the Second, Ramses the Great, 67 years on the throne, the most famous pharaoh who ever lived, one line, on a list. You will read today that the shaft held more than 50. The film could not trace that number past modern retellings. The clerk on the spot counted 30. The record keeps the clerk. Then they emptied it. A work party, a rope, a pulley, in a matter of days. The exact count is told differently in different books, and the film will not pretend to know it. Coffins that had lain still for 3,000 years came up into the sunlight and went down the cliff paths on shoulders to the river. At the bank, a museum steamer took them aboard, turned north, and carried the kings of Egypt down the Nile toward Cairo. And here the legend produces its most beautiful scene. As the steamer passed, the story goes, women lined the banks wailing and tearing their hair, and men fired rifles into the air, mourning the pharaohs leaving their valley. It is in half the books ever written about that summer. This film went looking for it, in the account written 1 month after the event in the museum men's own writings, and found it nowhere. It may have happened, but no document this film could reach says so. That is the difference between a record and a legend. And in this story of all stories, the difference is the point. What is documented is where they landed. The museum at Bulak, catalogued, numbered, and, for the first time in 3,000 years, guarded by people whose job was writing things down. Which brings us to the older crime, the one to put the kings in that shaft to begin with. "3,000 years earlier, under a king called Ramses the Ninth, the necropolis of Thebes was a working government district, with guards, inspectors, pay records, and a scandal. The mayor of the East Bank formally accused the West Bank's administration of letting the royal tombs be robbed on its watch. The charge was written down, so was everything that followed, and that document, called the Abbot Papyrus, is in the British Museum today. A commission crossed the river and physically inspected 10 royal tombs, one by one. The record of that walk survives. 9 were certified intact. 1, a king of an older dynasty, and his queen, had been emptied. Then it went to court. 2 days after a shouting match between the 2 mayors in front of witnesses, the great tribunal of Thebes took up the accusation. The inspectors testified. The accused workmen were questioned, and the mayor who blew the whistle lost. The specific men he named were found to know nothing. The court dismissed his charges and filed the report. That is the only complete verdict in the surviving record. Not a robber punished, but an accuser rebuked. If you want to know what the record actually keeps, it keeps that. The untidy outcome no legend would ever invent. But one tomb really was empty, and in another papyrus, someone confesses to it. His name was Amenpa-Nufer, a stonemason from the workman's village, questioned under the standard methods of the day. The record is frank that confession in that court began with a beating, and what he admitted, with 7 named accomplices, was the emptying of that older king's tomb, copper tools through the stonework, the gold and silver stripped and divided. He even explained in passing how the economy of it worked, how a man arrested once could go right back to the same trade. The court took it all down, names, method, split, and then the record does the thing this channel exists for. It goes silent. No sentence for Amenpa-Nufer survives. The books that tell you he was impaled are quoting the severity written into the charge, not any verdict, the film checked. 3,000 years of retelling have supplied an ending the document never had. The confession is eternal. The punishment is a blank. One more turn of the screw. That confession document was itself carried off and sold in the modern era and torn in two. Today the top half sits in Brussels and the bottom half in New York. 2 halves of one torn document, well over 5,000 kilometers apart. The Abbot Papyrus, the trial record, is a separate document, and it sits in London, one of the oldest robbery trials ever written down, and none of its paperwork is left in Egypt. Even the record of the robbery got robbed. Now hold the 2 summers side by side, 3,000 years apart. In each one, a hole in the Theban cliffs, a living made off the dead, an interrogation, and a confession that names names. The ancient hole was worked by a crew of workmen. The modern one belonged to a single family. The Bronze Age court wrote its record on papyrus. The 19th century wrote its record in a museum ledger and a clerk's tally. Both records survived. Almost nothing they described did. Every ounce of gold that passed through Amenpa-Nufer's hands is melted and vanished. The shaft at Deir el-Bahari is an empty hole. But the tally with Ramses on one line, the inspection that certified 9 tombs safe, the confession with a beating in it and no ending. You can read every word of them today. Paper beat gold. It always beats gold. That is the entire secret of history, told in one valley. The kings themselves came out of that shaft into the age of the catalogue, numbered, published, studied, argued over, remembered, in the end, more thoroughly than their own priests ever managed. Robbed twice and delivered both times to the only guardian that never sleeps, the written record. And the record keeps one more thread, one this channel has pulled before. The inspectors of Ramses the Ninth walked past it. The gatherers who filled the shaft never found it. The robbers broke in twice and were sealed out twice. A small tomb, under someone else's workmen's huts, holding a deleted boy king. The one grave in that whole valley that kept its gold. That film is already on this channel. The record remembers him too.